Our speaker, direct from Chicago, Carol Felsenthal, is a journalist whose in-depth magazine articles about numerous political figures have received wide acclaim. She's an author of several highly praised biographies on such high-profile figures as Alice Roosevelt Longworth, S.I. Newhouse Jr., and Katharine Graham. Welcome.
Thank you. When Dale asked me to be here today, she asked me what I wanted to talk about. And I wrote her saying, writing unauthorized biographies and magazine profiles. I do long-form magazine profiles, which are not in fashion today. Everything is being squashed and condensed. But I would do some 80 interviews, tape them, transcribe the tapes myself for the subjects of my magazine profiles, which included Michelle Obama, one of the more interesting people I profiled, and that profile appeared in January of 2009, so it was just after they moved into the White House. She's not a fan of mine, and she joins a group of people. I don't think I can think of a person who I wrote about deeply, researched extensively, who is a fan of mine. And I think what I try to do, what I wrote to Dale, is if you report deeply, write clearly, bravely, and objectively, your subjects will complain to your editor and likely will never speak to you again. One of my subjects was Chief of Staff to Barack Obama, is Bill Daley. He's the brother of Richard Daley, two Richard Daleys who were mayor of Chicago. And I see him, we recently moved and we live on Michigan Avenue now, or off Michigan Avenue, and I take a walk most days and I see Bill Daley on these walks. And if looks could kill, I'd be on the sidewalk. When my husband and I raised 3 children in Chicago, in the city, and my husband's a lawyer, none of them wanted to have anything to do with that. They all became writers. They all moved to New York, and they were all college English majors, as was I. When my daughter Julia got a job at an online magazine called Slate, which was then owned by the Washington Post, her editor sent out a memo to the staff of the magazine saying, Julia's mother has written unauthorized biographies of top editors at all the magazines Julia's worked at. Slate, as I say, was then owned by the Washington Post, and I wrote probably my most impactful book was a biography of Katharine Graham. And Katharine Graham not only didn't like the book, and I'm going to talk about this a little later, but she sent her lawyers out after me. Vanity Fair published an excerpt from the book that's in publishing lingo that's called First Serial. So the article comes out about a month before publication date. And if you read Vanity Fair, you know it's very juicy kind of coverage of public figures, a lot of gossip. And so what the editors of Vanity Fair did is they read my, I don't know, it was 900-page manuscript or something, and that was after it was cut by a third by my publisher, Putnam. And they take all the most salacious and the most unhappy parts of a story, and they just link them together, and then the writer writes transitions between those parts. So when Katharine Graham a month before the book hit the stores, saw the Vanity Fair article, she was, to put it mildly, upset. I'm going to skip over this. Just a little background. I decided very early in my life, when I was in elementary school in Chicago Public Schools, that I wanted to be a writer. And it was a kind of a zany decision for me to make, because I didn't have anybody. My parents did not go to college. I didn't have any mentors or anybody in my life who was a writer. But I realized early on that part of being an active, I don't know whether I'd call myself successful, but an active writer is you have to be a salesman. And my father was a great salesman of picture frames, and I think I inherited that trait from him. So I started out by showing up in the offices of the book editor at the Chicago Sun-Times without an appointment. And in those days, we're talking 1970s now, there was really, even at a major newspaper, there was no security at all. I walked into his office, and as I was walking in, he was having an argument with a writer, and he threw a book across the room at the writer, who was a staffer at the Sun-Times. And I said, I'm a writer, which wasn't true in the sense that I had never been published. And I want to review a book. And I think he was so flustered and embarrassed that he gave me a coming-of-age novel. I still remember the title. It was called Now Molly Knows. It was a wretched piece of writing, but I spent hours and hours and hours, and it went through something like probably 27 drafts. I turned it, and it was published, and then I sent that to every book editor in the country using my IBM Selectric typewriter. I wrote 2 books on a typewriter, and my first 2 books, and I got the Baltimore, most of they just ignored me, but I said enclosed as a sample of a recent review without saying enclosed as a sample of the only thing I've ever written in my entire life. But the Baltimore Sun sent me a novel by Gore Vidal called Burr, and that was an important novel, and I wrote a really interesting review of it. And then I was able to step up and step up and step up, and I started reviewing for the Chicago Tribune. And at the Chicago Tribune, I was given the assignment to review a book by Phyllis Schlafly, the anti-ERA activist. It was called The Power of the Positive Woman, and it was full of thanks to men who took the burden of work off of housewives by inventing the washing machine, so they didn't have to go to the river and knock their dirty clothes against a stone or something. But it was that kind of a theme. And then, of course, her early opposition to ERA, which she said would send women into combat and would cause us to have unisex bathrooms, and horror of horrors, would allow men to marry men, would lead to the closing of all women's colleges, would have an impact on the Girl Scouts. And I thought this was all nonsense, and I wrote a very negative review. And one thing that I learned is I've written many, many book reviews over the course of my career, but it is much easier to write a negative review, especially nonfiction, which is really the area where my expertise is. So the review appears, and at that time, now Chicago Tribune is a nothing newspaper. It's hugely diminished from, it's owned by a hedge fund, and it's just takes me 3 minutes to read. In those days, it was read all over the state, and it also had a national reputation. So this was in, I guess, late 70s, maybe 1978. no email. And my name Felsenthal is obviously Jewish. And I start getting letters in the mail, and they were so gross that I eventually started wearing latex gloves before I opened them. On the envelope, there were stickers that U.S. out of the UN, take back the Panama Canal. It's really interesting how many of these issues were somewhat sleepy issues, but they're back in the news. When I opened them, I would find anti-Semitic slurs, and it was really frightening to me. I felt very vulnerable. I remember one that had scrawled in red, "Go back to Poland." And so that was really my first experience of being hated for the writing that I did. Around that same time, I wrote a very long profile of Hannah Gray, who was then president of the University of Chicago. She was the first woman to be president of a major university. She had been provost at Yale, and she had been acting president of Yale for a year. She didn't get the Yale presidency, which I thought she richly deserved, because she was a woman, and ended up at the U of C, where she was deeply unpopular among the faculty and the students. For one thing, she invited Robert McNamara to campus to speak and to receive an award, and he was considered the architect of the Vietnam War, so there were huge protests. The university also, its college division, which today is much expanded and one of the most selective colleges in the country today, but back then, if you were a certain kind of intellectual student, the University of Chicago was a perfect place for you. The bookstore started selling sweatshirts and t-shirts that read, "The University of Chicago, where fun goes to die." And Gray agreed to be profiled, so to speak. And I didn't have a long legacy of articles, so she agreed. It became harder and harder as my career advanced to get people to be willing to talk to me. I was called the Kitty Kelly of Chicago. If you know of Kitty Kelly, if that name rings a bell at all, she had written about Frank Sinatra, about the royal family, about Nancy Reagan, and she was considered to be a slash and burn kind of writer. I am really not that, and I found, although I got to know Kitty Kelly and liked her very much, I knew her when she lived in Washington, D.C., and my writing is, I don't cut and paste from other writers. I go out and I do fresh interviews. And then I never, to this day, have had an assistant. So I would tape all these interviews, and at some points as I wrote books, I had stacks of cassette recordings that reached like halfway up to the ceiling of my office, and I had so much paper, because I transcribed them, they all go on paper, and then my file cabinets got full, and I'd pile them on the floor of my office, that the architect told us that we were damaging the foundation of our house. My office was at the top, and we were developing cracks, so I had to get rid of all the paper, but I could literally walk on stacks of paper like this, pressed closely together from my desk to a door that led outside. So I feel what I would do is I'd put all of these interviews and the research that I did together, and then I would write my stories, but I was never able to write without that kind of a backup. And I would talk to my husband about it at the end of the day, and he would say, Carol, you're going down a rabbit hole, stop, write the damn book and be done with it. And, you know, when I would think about, the reason that I could have the career that I've had was because I'm married to a lawyer who actually makes money, and I would, you know, I'd think about what I was making an hour for my work, and it would come out to about a nickel an hour. So, and I've had some really good years because my books have been optioned, and or rights have been sold, the first serial rights that I mentioned before. But some years have been extremely lean. But I pride myself on that. And the Hannah Gray piece, I think I probably interviewed 30 faculty members. I interviewed students. I interviewed Hannah Gray's brother. I was all over the place, and she hated the profile, which, you know, I would put my notes on index cards, and this was before I was using a computer. I could have used a computer, but I tend to shy away from technology. I'm a person who wishes that the internet didn't exist, and I wish that iPhones were never invented. But so I'd have all these index cards, and I'd arrange them on the floor of my office, and it was crazy, and it was tedious. And then one of my kids would walk in the office, or the dog would walk in, and all the index cards would be scattered, and I have to get down on the floor and rearrange everything. But in looking back at and reading that profile in preparation for this, I went into her office, and she was a very kind of like soldier-like woman, very straight posture, a helmet of sprayed hair. She looked almost Prussian. And I described the suit she was wearing as migraine-inducing because the pattern was so loud and it was like coming at me, and I get migraine headaches when there's squeals. And she really was upset about that. The other thing, the most embarrassing moment that I've ever had as a writer, and I regret doing it, was I asked her why she and her husband, who was a professor of history at the university, he had been at Yale with her, and then Chicago brought him over with her. I asked her why they never had children. And she, you know, it was a question that I shouldn't have asked. And she said, well, one would always like to have children, but that cemented her distaste for me. So after that piece was published, I had a call from one of the major women's magazines saying, just massage this piece a little for us, get another interview with Hannah Gray, and we want to publish it. And I thought, oh, great, because it's like recycling your own work. It wouldn't have required much effort on my part, and Hannah Gray said absolutely not. So that ended that. Another story that I wrote about this time was about an Illinois congressman who later later served on the U.S. Court of Appeals in D.C. His name was Abner Mikva, and he represented a district in the suburb of Evanston, a close-in suburb of Chicago. And he was I agreed with his values and his positions on issues 100%, and would have voted for him if I lived in that district. So he agrees to be profiled. He regretted it very deeply. And I was invited to follow him as he campaigned. In 1976, he won against a very photogenic Republican by 206 votes. So he was running for his life in 1978. And I was invited to follow him as he campaigned. And his wife, Zoe Mikva, was at my side as I followed him around to rallies where at each rally he would tell what his wife considered to be the same lame jokes. And she was actually very critical of him. She reminded me a little bit of Michelle Obama, who was always trying to knock Barack off of the pedestal that the country had put him on. And she would make these side jokes to me, and they were kind of insulting about her husband. But the rules of writing are, if you want to be off the record, you have to tell the writer that you're off the record. So when I wrote the story, I included all the Zoe Mikva stuff. And on the night of the election, we lived in a high-rise building and next to the elevator. So when the newspaper, I used to get 4 newspapers delivered every day. The newspaper deliverer, about 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning, would throw the newspaper against the door, and I was so worried that he would lose. And I thought if he lost, I was going to have to get out of this kind of writing, because I thought this is going to be my fault, and I'm going to have, I would have contributed to something that would have been a deep wrong, in my opinion. He ended up pulling off that election, and that's when he went on the Court of Appeals, and later he went to the White House and became chief of staff for Bill Clinton. Okay, let me move on here. Katharine Graham. Well, first a little bit about Alice Roosevelt Longworth, who was far and away the most fun subject I have written about in my career. When I started writing about her, she had recently died. And I was following the advice of my husband, who said, only write about dead people because they can't sue you. But I got in trouble in that one as well, because her granddaughter, who lived with her, Alice was really lacking in motherly skills. And her daughter was a deeply unhappy person who ended up committing suicide. And the daughter's daughter lived with Alice, and Alice had a wonderful relationship with the granddaughter, so it just skipped a generation, and they had a great, the granddaughter had a very different kind of personality. But among the things that I reported in the book from hours and hours of research was that Nick Longworth, the Longworth office building in DC is named after Nick Longworth. He was Speaker of the House. He married Alice in 1906 in the White House. It was huge worldwide news. And I reported in the book that Nick Longworth wasn't the father of the daughter, that the father was an Idaho senator, very prominent in foreign affairs at the time, named William Borah. So this caused a lot of angst in the family. And I was doing a publicity tour for this book, and I was doing an interview at the NPR affiliate in DC, and the granddaughter, it's going along swimmingly, the questions were good, I was in good form, and then a call comes in, and it's Alice's granddaughter, and my heart just fell to the floor. It was really painful. While I was writing that book, and when I was writing the Katharine Graham book, I spent days at the manuscript room of the Library of Congress. In those days, there was practically no security to get into that room. All you needed was a letter from a publisher saying that you're under contract to write this book, so that the room was full of writers. When I left, there was almost no attempt to see what was in my bag, and you go in and you say, I want the personal papers of Teddy Roosevelt, because Alice and her wedding and her escapades and her going up to the roof where father said, you cannot smoke under my roof, so she went up to the roof of the White House and smoked up there, and she wore pants at a time when that was considered to be a no-no. She refused to follow the custom in Washington of spending your days leaving your calling card at other prominent women's houses, and she wanted nothing to do with that. So I ordered up my request on Alice Longworth, and the Library Congress staffer comes up with a grocery cart, like the kind of cart that you would use at the grocery store. I was so surprised by it. And it's up to the top with original letters. One of the things that I had in the cart was the diary that Alice Longworth kept when she lived in the White House before she got married. She did not get along with Edith Roosevelt, who was her stepmother. TR's first wife died just at the time when Alice was born, and she and Edith were always at odds. Edith really didn't like her at all. And I'm reading the diaries, and in the saddest part of the diaries, she wrote in fountain pen, there were smudges, and I'm positive they were teardrops, and they would drop on the pages. And then you go there with pockets full of nickels and dimes, because if you want to make a photocopy, it costs 15 cents, and the copiers are at the back of the room. And then you take the diary and you push it down on the copy machine, which is, liable to cause damage to this original piece of history. So I did that, writing about Alice, and then about Kay Graham. So when I was interviewing for Alice Longworth, I interviewed scores of famous Washingtonians, senators, cabinet officers, editors, names of people who you would recognize. I sent a letter to Katharine Graham at the Washington Post, and Katharine Graham, in those years, she was a role model to young journalists coming up, and to my utter surprise, she agreed to the interview. So and in my letter to her, by that time I was using a computer, so I would cut and paste this tall a paragraph of people who I'd already interviewed, and I go into her office. One thing Katharine Graham would never leave her office at the Washington Post without addressing every letter and every piece of paper that came off of her desk. So the desk is completely clear, and she's sitting there in all of her regal grace, I was so nervous and so afraid of making an ass of myself in front of this amazing woman. And I realized that she was intimidated by me because I had interviewed all these people. And it was clear to me that the reason that she agreed to an interview was because other prominent people had been interviewed, and she wanted to be in the index along with everybody else. So she started doing something that I found is not unusual. She started telling me stories that probably would have been more discreet if she kept them to herself. One involved the drunken antics of a prominent senator's wife, and I'm recording this, and it's all on the record. I left her office, just praying that the recordings had worked and that I hadn't messed that up, because that's a huge concern. And when I would travel, I might have 20, 25 cassette recordings. Everywhere I went, even if I went out for dinner, I schlepped all these recordings because I was afraid I'd stay at cheap hotels to save my advance money, or occasionally I'd stay in somebody's guest room. And on the airplane, I would like keep them on my lap, like it was crazy neurotic behavior. I left her office and I went to the payphone, no cell phones yet, and I called my agent and I said, Alice book was about to be published, or it was maybe several months away, and I said, my next subject is Catherine Graham, because I realized that this woman who was such an icon of journalism was actually, in a way, she was insecure, scared, and very much worried about how she came off. And there's a New Yorker writer, she's no longer alive, named Janet Malcolm, who wrote a book called The Journalist and the Murderer. And it was very controversial, and I'll read you a couple lines from her story, which journalists were very much aggravated by. Janet Malcolm wrote, "Every journalist who is not too stupid or too full of himself to notice what is going on knows what he does is morally indefensible. He is a kind of confidence man preying on people's vanity, ignorance, or loneliness, gaining their trust and betraying them without remorse." I kind of see how that might apply to me in certain quarters. I knew when I was writing the Graham book, she was working on her memoir, and I would interview, for example, the editor, the former editor then of Time magazine. He still had his office in the Time Life building in New York. And when I walked into his office, he said, "Catherine Graham was sitting in the chair you're sitting in yesterday." So she was interviewing people for her memoir because she said she didn't trust her memory to get it right. And he told me she would appear with an entourage. She had somebody who operated her recording equipment. I was really envious of that. She had another person who did the transcriptions. She had another person who fed her the questions to ask. Later on, Catherine Graham told somebody who I interviewed for the book and developed a relationship with that her memoir would have been a different book if my book hadn't come out before hers, because I reported in it the affair that her husband, Phil Graham, had with a Newsweek reporter, his attempt to wrest control of the estate from Kay. The paper had been purchased by Kay Graham's father in the Washington Post, in a bankruptcy sale. Kay was the daughter of the family who was set to take over the paper. Then she married this brilliant Harvard Law School graduate, Phil Graham, and he was such a dazzling person that Kay's father said, "Forget running the paper, Phil's gonna run it," and he gave it to Phil. Well, Phil was an untreated, bipolar, manic depressive person, and he became, at the end of his life, like severely up and severely down. And Kay's father was Jewish, although he wanted, the man who bought the Washington Post, he wanted to be Treasury Secretary and knew that as a Jew he would not get that job. He did become the first head of the Federal Reserve. Her mother was not Jewish, and Kay was always very insecure about the roots, those Jewish roots, and Phil just played right in it. He would call her a kike. He would tell her that she was fat and unattractive. He brought Babe Paley in he said, "You look," I won't use the words he said, "You look like shit when you go out in public. I want you to look better." So he brought Babe Paley in to teach her how to dress and how to put herself together. So it was a hugely unhappy marriage, but he was a brilliant person. He claimed that over a weekend he wrote Lyndon Johnson's Great Society program. He was very close to JFK. They had many escapades together, and I won't go into them here. He was removed from the stage of a speech that he was giving to an association of newspaper publishers, started to remove his clothes on the stage. He was taken off the stage, put in a straitjacket, and sent to a rehab psychiatric center in Maryland. Kay forgave him, he begged forgiveness, and then he ended up shooting himself in the head, committing suicide several months before the assassination of JFK. That book was difficult because Kay Graham put out the word "don't talk" to this writer. Her son, Don Graham, who later ran the Post, wrote me a very polite letter saying that he couldn't talk to me. Her daughter was furious with me. She didn't talk to me. Ben Bradley wrote me an interesting letter and said, "I'd love to talk to you, and I believe in talking to people like you, but you have to understand that I just can't." And after the book was published, he said that he read every item in the index concerning him, and I was right on every account, so I felt good about that. One of the people who had been a former important Post reporting, a man named Carl Meyer, later went and wrote editorials for the New York Times. I interviewed him in his office at the old New York Times building, and he was really one of my great sources for the book. After the book was out, he wrote me a letter and he said, "I found only one mistake. You confused the Times of London with the Sunday Times of London." And then he told me, he said, "My wife is really irritated with me because once I appeared in your biography of Catherine Graham, the invitations to Martha's Vineyard stopped." So after the Vanity Fair piece came out, I was like feeling really great. I didn't have another book contract yet, and I'll talk about that in a second. But I'd been working so hard. I had a 2-year-old son, and I was going to take him for his first haircut. He had these beautiful blonde curls, and it was going to be his first. We were going to spend the day with him, and I didn't do that often. And as I was getting ready to go, I got a letter from my editor at Putnam saying, "I just wanted you to know we received a letter from Kay's law firm." It was some big firm in New York, and they're going to sue. And I was terrified. Just like I saw myself leaving Chicago and my family and being in a room in New York or Washington doing depositions. Putnam stopped promoting the book. They were so freaked out by the threat of the suit. And the woman, Phyllis Gran, who ran Putnam at the time, she told my editor that Putnam would never publish, after this experience, would never publish another unauthorized biography. But they gave me the lawyer, a wonderful lawyer who represented me, and she had been Woodward and Bernstein's lawyer. She was at an outside firm. And I spent months in my office tripling and quadrupling my sources for most lines in the book, and it was really terrible, but eventually it worked out. Ted Turner, when the Vanity Fair piece came out, he bought the rights to make what was called a biopic out of the Graham book, and that was like terrific. And there was Vanity Fair, and I was making some money then, and I was, so excited. We were talking about who was going to play Catherine Graham, and everything was looking up. And then Ted Turner was then married to Jane Fonda, And Jane Fonda was friends with Kay's eldest son, who lived in Los Angeles, and she persuaded him to drop it. So just one little more thing about that. So then I was paid the full fee for it, but my agent, my film agent, told me this: she is so prominent, so powerful, and people are so fearful of her that we will never sell rights to this book until she dies. So I'm sitting at my desk. This is now July 2000. I'm sitting at my desk, and a CNN reporter called me and wanted me to comment on the importance of Kay Graham in the wake of her death. And I finished that call and got off the phone, and I called the film agent. I said, "She's dead, now sell it." So he sold it to HBO. And these things are very, very slow. They hired Joan Didion to write the screenplay. And that was in the wake of the deaths of her husband and her daughter. And the screenplay, which of course we recently moved, and that was one of the things I moved because I thought, wow, here I am, this kid with no connections, and Joan Didion's writing the screenplay. That was like, there couldn't be anything that would have happened that would have filled me with more delight. Then I read the screenplay, and it was deeply weird. And I thought that it involved ghosts and the reemergence of people in her life, and it was just a really strange screenplay. So the HBO brought in another writer, then the recession happened, and HBO was reorganized. We were casting it. It was green-lighted, and we were casting it, and then it never got made. They paid me, but it never got made. So there have been a couple of other instances. And I need somebody to tell me when I should stop talking, because I have like 15 more pages of notes here. Just a couple of things. Maybe I'll end with this, but do you recognize the name Ann Landers in this audience? So what I find that is truly dispiriting to me is that many of the people who I have written about, people in their 20s, maybe their early 30s, never heard of them. And for example, I did a very I think interesting, I'm promoting myself, but I thought it was a very good profile of the film critic Roger Ebert. And when I mention his name to young people, if I'm teaching or lecturing, they just look at me blankly. They'd never heard of him. They didn't know Ann Landers. Anyway, so Ann Landers had died shortly before I started writing about her. And I've done this a couple of times. She lived on this short block in Chicago called East Lakeshore Drive, which is full of, Chicago doesn't have co-ops. There's mostly it's condominiums. But the really, really exclusive buildings, the buildings that for years have been restricted buildings, meaning no Jews, no blacks, blah, blah. But anyway, on this strip block, Ann Landers lived, and she, in this apartment, entertained the most famous people in the world, actors, actresses, presidents. Bill Clinton was a regular at her apartment. I, with a lot of legwork, tracked down the woman who took care of her as she was dying. She had multiple myeloma and decided she didn't want to extend her life by going through the chemo and therapy. So she died a very painful death, and she was pretty much alone with her caregiver, who was a woman from the Philippines who had been a school teacher in the Philippines. I found her, took her out to lunch, she agreed to talk to me, and then I found another person who let me into the apartment, her apartment. And what I found there was that her daughter, who is another person who's not fond of me, Her daughter had auctioned off her belongings. Ann Landers did not have great art or important furniture, but she had correspondence from Winston Churchill, Lyndon Johnson, Jackie Kennedy. And her daughter went to Christie's and Sotheby's, and they said, no, we're not interested. She bought in these second-tier auction houses. And when I went into the apartment, there were literally tags with prices on them on her, this sounds really gross, but even on her underwear. Everything was being sold to the highest bidder. Her collection of letters, which were extraordinary, were scattered all over the country. The Chicago Public Library wanted them. They got some, but not what they should have gotten. Next, she would write, she didn't sleep. Well, she slept, but she would work on her letters sitting in the bathtub at 4 o'clock in the morning. And then she'd go to sleep, and she'd sleep like until 1 o'clock in the afternoon or noon. And so the bathtub still had all of her products, you know. It was like going into somebody's bedroom uninvited or closet and start looking around. Next to her bed was a list of 20 people who she named as the people who she cared about and who cared most about her. So her best friends, and it had their names and it had their telephone numbers. So I took my phone out and took pictures of the pages, and I had like this gold mine of people to interview. And I'm sure I called all 20 people on the list and maybe yielded 14 or 15 interviews. There was a lot of ruckus raised over the person who I would never name who let me into the apartment. And the caregiver, I said, you know, if you talk to me and I quote you, if there's going to be any bequests to you in the estate, you're going to be in trouble. And she said, no, I want to talk to you. And I got some really interesting things. And the last thing that I'll say before I be quiet is Ann Landers is from Iowa. Her parents were immigrants. And her twin sister, Abby, they didn't speak for years. They were totally estranged until the end of Abby's life when she was developing Alzheimer's, and they had to reunite then. But she had a fascination with Catholicism, and she loved the beauty of the church. She loved the rules. She loved the kind of, what she saw as reassuring values of the Catholic Church. And in maybe the 20 years before she died, she developed a very close relationship with a Jesuit priest who was what's called her walker. In other words, if she was invited to every charity event and here and around the country and the world. She was an international figure, and he would accompany her, sometimes wearing his collar, sometimes not. And I found out who he was, and I called him, and I thought, no, I'm never going to hear back from this man. But he called me back, and I'm to this day a friend of his, and some of the amazing stories in the Ann Landers piece, which I just reread, and I reread and I thought, did I really write this? The research was so extensive, the number of people quoted. I had a reputation for getting a contract with an assignment for 5,000 words and delivering 15,000 or 20,000, and you can see by the way I talk that I probably matched that in my writing. So I'll take questions or comments. I've got half my notes unread, so I may have to come back.
If you use the microphone, please put it close to your mouth so we can all hear your question.
So, given the complexity of human beings in general, do you think it's possible, given the research that you do on your books, to write an unauthorized biography that someone is happy with?
Well, I wrote an unauthorized book about Bill Clinton, and he was a very slippery subject. But there were people who I interviewed in the book, for example, Leon Panetta, who went on to be head of the CIA and defense secretary. He was Bill Clinton's chief of staff. So I didn't hear from Bill Clinton. I think I was too unimportant, but I wrote quite a bit about, I consider Bill Clinton to have had a term and a half, because halfway through his second term, the Monica Lewinsky story broke, and he was never able to come back from that. He was truly a pariah. When he left the White House, people felt sorry for him. They'd go to Chappaqua, which was the house that they bought, which allowed Hillary to run for the Senate. But he was by himself. He was a lonely guy. One of the things I report in the book was that he went to a concert in Harlem, and nobody wanted to, he had a secret service, but nobody wanted to be seen with him or to sit next to him. But Panetta, I think, my guess is that Panetta thought that he would stay on his walnut farm in California and that he wasn't going to go into public service. But he described these morning meetings that they had, and Clinton would stay up all night, and he would get people around him to play hearts with him. And if he asked Panetta to play, Panetta felt it was incumbent on him to do so. He said it was exhausting. And then they would have their morning meeting, and Clinton would come in with his running shorts on and his, white legs, and he'd sit down and he would immediately fall asleep. And Panetta described, the mouth open and, in really big detail. The other person who I talked to was Eric Holder, and he became fast friends with Obama. They didn't know each other until Obama was elected. And when I interviewed him, he had been involved with those pardons, history repeating himself. On the way out, Clinton gave a pardon to a very controversial figure named Mark Rich. And Eric Holder was called under oath in front of Congress to testify. And when I didn't think he'd talk to me, but he did. And he said, I'm never going back into public service. I find it hard to get out of bed in the morning. My wife has to constantly buck me up. And then he sat at a dinner party. I think it was a party that Pamela Harriman hosted in Georgetown, and Obama and he bonded, and Michelle and Eric Holder's wife bonded, and then Eric Holder had this, career after that in the Obama White House. But to answer your question, I realize I didn't answer it. I don't know. It's a tough thing, because if you do the research and it's relevant, there's a lot of the most, you may not believe me, but a lot of the most salacious, gossipy stuff ends up on the cutting room floor. And of course, there are editors. Like when I was writing about Bill Daley, I got into the subject of his divorce. And Bill Daley knew, I interviewed Bill Daley extensively, but he knew that I was asking around about what happened to his marriage. And the next thing I knew, my editor called me and said, stop asking about the divorce. And I said, well, that's not right. And we went back and forth, and then I stopped asking about the divorce, to tell you the truth. So.
Of all those that you've written about, who did you end up liking more than you expected to after you wrote about them?
Well, Alice Longworth, I would say, she was just a character, such a character, and she lived her, she had been, her biggest enemy was Woodrow Wilson. There's a lot of history in this. She was absolutely opposed to the League of Nations, but as she grew older, she became a more liberal-minded person, and she would just tell you what she thought. She had this, in the front yard of her house, which I wasn't inside, but I spent a lot of time outside it. She deliberately grew poison ivy on her front lawn, and then she had the famous pillow, which I kind of relate to, which is if you haven't anything nice to say about anyone, come sit next to me. So she was enormously, and she was friends with Richard Nixon. And he wrote me a long letter describing his relationship with her. And I very stupidly, when we moved in November of 2023, tossed a file that I realized had his letter with his signature. So I'd say her. I also ended up, in a way, understanding and liking Michelle Obama better than I went into it. I realized she was a remarkable person, and I tracked down her roommate at Princeton, who, when she was a white girl from New Orleans, single mother, and when she arrived at the dorm room, she had been assigned to room with Michelle. And, of course, you don't choose your roommates these days, so they had been assigned to room together. And the mother took personal affront to placing her daughter with an what she called a urban black. And so she went over to the office, the housing office at Princeton, and said, this is wrong and you shouldn't have done this. And they said, well, we can't do anything about it, but if your daughter wants to move out at the semester, we'll put her in another room. So the daughter did that, and then when I interviewed her, she said, I consider my biggest mistake in life was to have listened to my mother, because Michelle was the most wonderful person, and I didn't have enough insight to tell my mother to stay out of it and to remain with Michelle. But she said when they would see each other on campus after that, they barely acknowledged each other. And so, I found a whole, I interviewed so many of her classmates. I went to her high school in Chicago and interviewed the people who had taught her. So I'd say Michelle, she was a very down-to-earth person, and she did not she was angry as hell with Barack for being in the Illinois State Senate when he could have had Sidley and Austin, a big Chicago law firm. They wanted him to stay so badly. He was the first, president of the Harvard Law Review, editor-in-chief, first African-American to hold that position. He was on the front page of the New York Times. They wanted Barack to stay at the firm, and he would have made 7 figures, and Michelle thought not only 7 figures, but he'd get a driver, and instead he's in the Illinois State Senate, which doesn't carry a lot of prestige and is very poorly paid. And then he ran for Congress and lost. And when he ran for the Senate, he was the luckiest man alive, because the Democrat who was supposed to win had been accused of kicking his wife. And when the papers were opened up, that for sure this guy was going to be the next senator. His campaign dissolved into nothing, and then Barack became the candidate. And when at the 2004 Democratic National Convention, he gave just one of the best political speeches you could ever hear. And he said that when he walked into that speech, nobody knew who he was. When he walked out of the speech, he was Mick Jagger. And then he started making quite a bit of money. His book, Dreams from My Father, we shared an editor, and the editor told me that book, what wasn't selling. And then after that speech, it was a #1 bestseller, and he was making money on speeches, and their lives improved. And Michelle she grew up in a 2-room apartment and shared a bedroom with her brother, and she wanted a stable family life. Barack was never around to take care of the daughter. She'd make lists of things for him to do, and he respected her, and I think he was afraid of her, so he would comply with what she wanted. But a good part of the time, he was on the road, and I remember his campaign manager told me he was with Barack when he was in the state senate, but he had national ambitions, and he calls Michelle and he says, I'm speaking in front of a church someplace in Podunk, Illinois, and downstate, and he says, they're really drinking the juice. And Michelle said to him, you don't have enough money to buy your own juice or something like that. She was totally deflating. Or he would call her and say, they love me here, and she'd say, Malia has an ear infection, and that's what I'm concerned about, and bang, put the phone down. And they were in marriage counseling. She was very upset with him until the Senate race, and then the unlikely against Hillary Clinton victory and his 2 terms as president. So
Those were the days when something like kicking your wife would disqualify you from office.
They had an argument, and he said that he, apparently his foot moved and he got her in the ankle, and I guess the marriage must have been bad, and she complained, and those things you really can't recover. I mean, Pete Hegseth, wow, he's recovered. It's amazing. It's amazing how things have changed and how frightening the idea of Pete Hegseth being in charge of the Defense Department. But my guess, I don't know, and I haven't seen any the only one is Susan Collins, who may vote against it. But the Republicans have a little cushion, so my guess is they'll get through.
Thank you, Carol. But,